Hey everybody, my name is Dr. Mike Roussel and I welcome you to today's seminar all about protein. We're going to look at protein myths, requirements, and optimal intakes. Protein seems to be a rather controversial topic. How much is too much? How much is dangerous? How much do you need? And so hopefully we're going to answer a lot of your questions in today's seminar. So let's get right to it. A brief overview of the different things we're going to cover. So we're going to look at, what is the difference between protein requirements and then also optimal intake. And looking at these two differences is where there's a lot of confusion in regards to how much protein do you need. Because some people are saying, well, you only need X, but they're referring to your actual requirement, like what's required by your body. While other people are saying, well, you probably need Y. And they might be referring to what research shows is optimal for improving heart health or body composition or weight loss. So we're going to look at that. We're also going to look at some common protein myths, such as that high protein diets are bad for your kidneys and your liver and your bones. And are those things true? And at what level that we're eating protein should we start being concerned about those things? Then we're going to move on to looking at how protein can improve your heart health and also your body composition. So if you're looking to lose weight, how protein can help with that. And then finally, we're going to talk about taking all these things and see how can we best put it into action in your life and your diet. So once we kind of shift through and sift through all the myths and look at all the information, then how do we apply it to your diet and what's the best way to go about doing it? So first, we talked about this required versus optimal. And this is really where a lot of the confusion comes with protein intake, because what your body requires to function is not necessarily what's optimal. So an example of this would be gasoline. So your car requires gas, so you can give it unleaded gasoline. But would it be better if you used the high test stuff that, is 10 or 15 cents more per gallon? Would your car function more optimally? I would say yes. So what's required versus what is optimal is, not always the same thing. And when we talk about protein, this has to do with the RDA. So the RDA stands for Recommended Dietary Allowance. And what the RDA is the RDA is a value that's not generated, but determined by, some of the country's top nutritional scientists to look at, what are the values, not just for protein, but lots of things, vitamins and minerals and different fats. And what the RDA is technically, the definition is, it's the average daily dietary nutrient intake level that's sufficient to meet the nutrient needs for nearly all healthy individuals in a particular stage of life or gender group. So basically, it's not the average intake, but they went and said, well, what would be an intake that covers so that 97 or 98% of all healthy individuals in a given age range, and they usually do it by gender and then clump by age, that if they this much, say with protein, that would be enough that everyone would be safe. So it's really a requirement. It's really looking at, what is required for proper function. And if you look at for men and women and adults, that the RDA for protein is 46 and 56 grams per day. So this is the amount of protein that 97 to 98% of all healthy men and women that are adults, 19 and older, would need to meet their protein needs. To meet, your body has proteins made up of amino acids, and in order to get enough essential amino acids so your body can function, you're going to need 46 grams per day if you're a woman and 56 grams per day if you're a man. So a lot of people take this and say, well, that's all the protein you need. And I think that's incorrect. And we're going to look at this a little bit deeper, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. And hopefully at the end of this talk, you'll see the difference between optimal and required. So these are the numbers. You might also hear, I just want to throw out some other numbers, you might also hear 0.8 grams per kilogram is also the RDA for protein, just another way of putting it. And what this comes out to, and just because we're going to talk a little bit about percent of the total calories, like oftentimes nutritional scientists look at food, proteins, carbohydrates, and fats in relationship to the rest of your diet. So with protein, this usually comes out to about 15% of all the calories you're going to eat, is usually where the RDA settles. So if we move on from the RDA and we move on to another value that has been generated by this group of scientists from the Institute of Medicine, the Food and Nutrition Board. We're talking about the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. So the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, or abbreviated the AMDR, is similar to the RDA. It's a group of values, but it's a little bit different. Basically what the AMDR is it's a range, and it's a range that these nutritional scientists have deemed acceptable for an intake of a given nutrient. So when we talk about protein, the AMDR for protein is 10 to 35% of total calories. So what the researchers have done is they've looked at all, essentially they did this back in 2005 was the last time that they came out with these for protein, carbohydrates, and fats. But what they did was they looked at all the research and they said, what would be an acceptable range for protein intake? Not what's required, but what's acceptable. Looking at the data that we have, if we go much lower than this, it would be detrimental, and much higher than this, we don't really know what's necessarily going on. Could be bad, could be good. We don't really know, so proceed with caution, right? And so that's what the acceptable macronutrient distribution range is. So we're looking at 10 to 35% of calories. So this gives you a good framework for healthy protein intake. And now what do these numbers mean, right? So 10% is like just below what the RDA would be. And the upper end, 35%, is just above what would be eaten if someone was on the zone diet. So the zone diet is about 30% calories. So it's a little bit more than the amount of protein you'd eat with a zone diet, which most people kind of are somewhat familiar with. So like I said, this is a framework for healthy protein intakes. And I always caution people against going above this 35%, because what happens is you start displacing other foods, because percents are out of a whole. So by eating more protein, right, that means you're going to be eating less of other things. And when we start pushing protein above 35% of total calories, that means you have to start eating less of other things. And is that going to be optimal? I really don't think so. And there's also not a lot of research that speaks to protein intakes above this. Are you really getting much more benefit above this 35%? So we'll look into a little bit later and talk about how protein intakes on the higher end of this AMDR, in that 30 to 35% of total calories, are more optimal for your heart health and your body composition. But before we do that, I wanted to get into protein lies and myths. So we've established the difference between what's required, the RDA, what your body actually needs, and what, is acceptable or could be optimal, which is that AMDR. So, it's very fluid. It's a range, and we can see kind of what's best for us. So let's briefly look at some common, yet very untrue, myths that have to do with protein. So the first one is that eating more protein is going to damage your kidneys. And what this comes from is the fact that your kidneys are responsible for filtering the end products of protein metabolism and digestion, right, and breakdown. So when your body breaks down and metabolizes protein into amino acids and other components, right, your kidney is responsible for filtering out, these end products. So more protein, right, more filtering from your liver, or for your kidney, that's kind of where the thought process lies. So one thing you may have heard is a high protein diet increases the stress on your kidneys. And that I stress the word stress because it's often referred to, that's this negative that's, negatively impacting your health and impairing and damaging your kidneys. So impairing kidney function and damaging them. But what's interesting is that research shows us that moderate changes in protein intake cause adaptive alterations in renal size and function without an indication of adverse effects. And this is a direct quote from a research study about looking at when you increase protein intake. So what this is really telling us is that when you increase your protein intake, your kidneys adapt to this added workload, right? Just like your muscles would when you're lifting weights. And this is a normal physiological response. This is what your body's supposed to do. If your kidneys is responsible for filtering byproducts from protein intake, right, for protein metabolism, when you eat more protein, it's going to need to become better at filtering those things because there's going to be more of it around. Now, studies involving people with kidney disease show that lowering protein intake can improve kidney function. But one of the things that's always important and that I always stress to clients is that when looking at scientific research, the population that's being studied is very important. People with kidney disease are very different than people with normally functioning kidneys. So if you have normally functioning kidneys, you see this increase in renal size and function. Renal size is like your kidney cells, so kidney cell size and function. Because your body's normally responding, it's a normal adaptation. It's not damaging your kidneys. So the next common myth is that eating more protein is going to damage your liver. Now this is kind of a case of a chicken and egg argument gone wrong. Okay? And one of the reasons is that people with liver disease have trouble metabolizing protein and building proteins from amino acids because their liver is damaged. So your liver is, very intimately involved in protein metabolism, in building proteins that are needed for all kinds of function, and then also breaking down proteins, turning them into energy. There's a lot that goes on. Your liver is really your metabolic brain. But saying that, knowing that people with liver disease have trouble with protein synthesis and metabolizing proteins, but taking this information, right, then people go and make the false assumption that as a result, increased protein intake causes liver disease. Okay, but this is just not the case. A healthy functioning liver can process protein intakes within the AMDR, potentially beyond, we don't really know, right, with no problems. So a lot of the myth that increased protein intake is going to impair and hurt your liver function has to do with the fact that people with liver disease, people with have a liver that's functioning incorrectly, not functioning well, they can't process as much protein. But it's because their liver is damaged. If your liver is normal and healthy, there's no evidence really to show that you can't consume and metabolize and use proteins within the AMDR. Then the last piece here has to do with osteoporosis and your bones. So the other myth that you might hear is that eating more protein will cause osteoporosis or increase your likelihood of osteoporosis. But what's really interesting is that there is no evidence that high protein intake would be detrimental to bone mass and strength. And this is a direct quote from another research paper. And the truth behind this is that it's just a lot more complicated than you'd think, and a lot more complicated than these kind of sound bites and messages that you'll commonly hear. So the biochemical link that points to these negative effects between protein intake and bone health, one of the reasons it's more complicated is because it actually has to do with how much calcium you're eating as well. And so when scientists, their kind of best guess is that when protein intake, when the amount of protein that you're eating reaches 2.5 times the RDA, right? So this is outside of the AMDR that we were talking about, outside of that acceptable range. So when it goes above and beyond what we would ever eat, and your calcium intake goes below 600 milligrams per day, okay, just kind of as a point of reference, you want to shoot to have 1,000 milligrams of calcium per day, or 1,200 milligrams if you're over 50 years old. And, 1 cup of non-fat yogurt has about 415 milligrams of calcium, and a cup of skim milk has about 305 grams of calcium. Okay, so if you were eating 2.5 times the RDA and also eating less than 60% of the recommended calcium intake, potentially there might be a connection between protein intake and increasing risk of osteoporosis. Potentially. Okay? So that's much, grayer and a lot more assumptions than high protein intakes are bad for your bones. And what's really interesting is the flip side of things, especially in older individuals, not eating enough protein is a bigger problem, because not enough protein is actually bad for your bone health, and not enough protein can actually increase your risk for osteoporosis. So, when we were talking about, I think why I like the AMDR, why I like that range so much, is because it shows, lower than this, it could be detrimental. Higher than this, it also could be detrimental. So let's just stay within that range. So now let's move to optimal intakes and find out, what's optimal? How can we optimize the protein intakes in our diet? I'm first speaking directly to heart health, and I wanted to include heart health in this because it's really one of the areas that's driving a lot of the research behind finding what's the optimal intake for protein. Cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer above and beyond for both men and women in America. And so there's a lot of money in cardiovascular disease research, and as a result, that's where a lot of the protein research is. So we talk about optimal intakes and heart health. I want to talk about the OmniHeart study. So several years ago, there was a study called the OmniHeart study, and it wanted to look at the impact of increasing protein on heart health. So in this study, researchers took a DASH diet, and a DASH diet has about 18% calories for protein, which is a little bit more than the RDA, like we talked about. And what they did was they increased it to 28% of total calories. So for those of you not familiar with the DASH diet, basically with the DASH diet, DASH is an acronym that stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension, hypertension being high blood pressure. The DASH diet is really currently seen as the gold standard of heart-healthy diets and the gold standard of diets for reducing risk for heart disease. And it's been rigorously studied in lots of clinical trials for over the past 20 years. So these OmniHeart researchers, what they did was they were able to actually make the DASH diet more effective by increasing the protein content from 18 to 28% of total calories. And what they found was that compared to this regular DASH diet, the diet that's considered currently the gold standard of heart-healthy diets, that the higher protein version of this diet led to greater decreases in blood pressure, greater decreases in LDL or your bad cholesterol, greater decreases in total cholesterol, and greater reductions in your 10-year estimated risk for cardiovascular disease. So there's an equation called the Framingham equation that's used to estimate, what is your chance of getting heart disease in the next 10 years. And they were able to, this higher protein diet caused the greatest reductions in estimated risk, 10-year risk of heart disease. So it's pretty obvious from this study here that adding a little bit of protein, a little extra protein to your diet is going to improve heart health. So next, I wanted to move on to body composition because this is something that I know lots of people are very interested in. What can protein do for body composition? So one study showed, and I'm going to highlight a bunch of different studies just to kind of illustrate the point here, that a little extra protein, and most of these studies were looking at about 30% of total calories. So right around where that OmniHeart is, and right below the AMDR. That after 8 weeks, people on a higher protein diet compared to a traditional diet, which would have about the RDA, the regular amount of protein, that after 8 weeks, the higher protein diet lost 2.8 more pounds of body fat, specifically, not weight, but body fat. Another study looked at specifically where weight loss was coming from, and after 12 weeks of the total weight lost, the higher protein group lost 1.5 more pounds specifically in the abdominal region. And this, when we talk about health and risk of chronic disease, that's really the abdominal region. That is kind of the most dangerous body fat you can have. And increasing your protein intake can target that body fat loss. And another study showed that after 12 weeks, the higher protein diet, the people who were eating about double the RDA or 30% of total calories, not only did they have more fat loss, but they also had less muscle loss than people on the lower protein diet. And at the beginning of the section, I talked about body composition. And body composition is what your body is made of. That's why we like to talk about where is the fat loss coming from. And higher protein diets are better at holding on to your muscle while you're dieting. So in the end, you're not only going to feel better and be stronger and be leaner, but you're also going to look better. So improving your body composition and improving fat loss while minimizing muscle loss is really one of the most important things. So where does that put us? Of the different studies that I've highlighted and looked at here with heart health and also with body composition, 30% of total calories seems to be the sweet spot for optimizing that. And 30% of total calories is also well within the AMDR, if you remember, is 10 to 35% of total calories. But if you're not a nutritional scientist, you might be thinking, well, 30% of calories, what does that even mean? Right? How is that even practical? So the short answer is, in order to eat about 30% of total calories from your diet, you want to make sure that you have protein at every single meal. Every time that you sit down to eat, you want to have some protein. Now, traditionally, most Americans eat a very protein-rich dinner. So they don't eat much protein at breakfast, they don't eat much protein at lunch, but then they have a huge amount of protein at dinner. And this is not optimal, okay? So one of the reasons why this is not optimal is that research shows us that by spreading out our protein intake throughout the day, it's going to allow us to maximize protein synthesis, which is muscle building, right? So this is very important for supporting muscle growth and also preventing muscle loss. Spreading your protein intake out throughout the day also makes it a lot easier to get 30% of your calories from protein. So what they did when they were looking at how do they maximize this, is they gave people basically, like the average American would have, a majority of their protein at night versus spaced out throughout the day. And what they found was that when you space it out throughout the day, that you get these big spikes in protein intake with each meal. But if you have all your protein just at dinner, you just get one big bump in protein intake. And that there's a threshold. It seems to be about 30 grams of protein. So despite the fact that dinner was 60 or 70 grams of protein, the amount of protein synthesis, the amount of kind of muscle building that would occur was the same as if they just had 30 grams at breakfast or lunch or as a snack or at dinner. So you want to spread out your protein intake throughout the day, and that's going to allow you to maximize, kind of maximize this phenomenon of this protein synthesis, and also hit that calorie target of 30% of total calories. Now, the one area that I wanted to mention, because this is the sticking point for most people, is snacking. Snacking is the problem. Getting protein in at your snack time. If you're going to have a snack, say at 3 in the afternoon, or you're going to have a mid-morning snack around 10 o'clock between breakfast and lunch, snacking is always the issue because most snack foods are high in carbohydrates and high in fats because those things are very shelf stable. Protein is not very shelf stable. So you need to be a little creative. You need to know you're not going to be able to snack on the same things that everybody else is. You're going to need to do things like maybe you're going to have a protein shake. Maybe you're going to have a meal replacement shake or a protein bar, Greek yogurt, a low sodium beef jerky, nuts even, or cheese like string cheese. String cheese and a piece of fruit is a great snack. So snacking is going to be something that's the sticking point for most people. And having a nice higher protein snack is also, if you have it mid-afternoon, it's going to kind of help curb your hunger for dinner, so you maybe don't eat as large of a dinner. But it's also going to give you that extra bump there right in the middle of the day in protein synthesis and help you meet your protein targets and protein needs for the day. So kind of summarizing today's talk, there's a big difference between what's required and what is optimal. And oftentimes when people talk about how much protein you need, they're really talking about just requirements and not optimizing. And I want to be with you all about optimizing, how you can get the best results with the effort that you're going to give. Adding a little bit more protein to your diet is most likely going to benefit you and help you optimize your diet. So with protein, a little bit more is going to be better, not worse. We want to stick within that range, that acceptable macronutrient distribution range. We're not talking about eating half your calories from protein. That would just be crazy. Okay, just a little bit more protein, and you can do this by eating protein at every meal. That's a really simple way to optimize your protein intake to come close to that 30% target and maximize the effectiveness and harness the effectiveness of protein in your diet. Okay, so that's going to wrap it up for today's talk. If you have any questions, feel free to post them below the video if you're watching this, depending on where you're watching this. And thanks so much, and have a great day.